Hello, everyone, and welcome to the November meeting of the Linnean Society of New York. I'm Debbie Mullins, the president, and I now call this meeting to order. If you're a lister, you probably pay attention to the annual announcement of lumps and splits. If you're not familiar with this, it's a change in a species' taxonomic classification that's triggered by new scientific data, often genetic data, that show how closely two species are related. Listers pay attention to this because a lump will result in a loss of a species on someone's life list, while a split might yield an additional species. The most notable changes this year were the lumping of two western birds we sometimes see in the Northeast, the Cordilleran flycatcher and the Pacific slope flycatcher. These have been lumped into one species now called the western flycatcher. The northern goshawk was split into two species, the Eurasian goshawk, a rare vagrant from Europe, and the American goshawk. The lumping of the two flycatchers was the subject of a recent podcast from the American Birding Association. It was very interesting, and I encourage you to listen to it. Perhaps of greater significance was the announcement by the American Ornithological Society, the AOS, that it will be changing the English names of all birds named after people. Their website states that in 2020, reflecting the heightened awareness of systemic racism and the need to address these injustices across society, there was a public petition to the AOS to change all English bird names that were named directly after people, because several of the honored individuals are identified as symbols of racism and colonialism. These changes are expected to take place sometime next year, and hopefully will lead to greater participation by people of color in birding and ornithology. We have the results of the two motions you were asked to approve last week. The minutes of the October meeting were approved by a vote of 136 in favor, none opposed, and 3 abstaining. You also unanimously approved 7 people as new members of the Society. The vote was 139 in favor and none opposed. Our new members are Gauri Nanjan Gad, sponsored by Mary Beth Cooper, Malcolm Fenton, sponsored by Deborah Shapiro, excuse me, Nita Balta, sponsored by Amanda Bielskis, Barry Elkins, sponsored by Joe DiCostanzo, Carrie Howland Cruz, sponsored by Richard Davis and Shannon Kelly, Casey Reddig, sponsored by Elise Boger, and Arabella Pajuhi, sponsored by Mary Beth Cooper. I want to extend a very warm welcome to all these new members. We're happy to have you in the Society, and I hope you'll find your membership rewarding. If anyone listening is not a member, please join us. The membership application is on our website, linneannewyork.org/members. If you don't know anyone to sponsor you, please list me, Debbie Mullins, or any of our board members as your sponsor. We value diversity and inclusion, and everyone is welcome to join. So now let's turn to tonight's program. Your microphone and the chat function have been disabled as usual, but if you have questions for Dr. Donoghue, please type them into the Q&A feature. And after the presentation, Vice President Doug Futuma will moderate a question and answer session. Michael Donoghue joined Yale University in 2000 as the G. Evelyn Hutchinson Professor of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. He has served as chair of that department, as well as serving in numerous other positions, including director of the Peabody Museum of Natural History, vice president for West Campus Planning and Program Development, director of Yale's Marsh Botanical Garden, the Institute of Biospheric Studies, and curator of biology botany and paleobotany in the Peabody Museum. Dr. Donoghue earned his undergraduate degree from Michigan State University and his PhD in biology from Harvard University. He's a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, a member of the National Academy of Sciences, and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. His research concerns the diversity and evolutionary history of plants and connections between phylogeny, biogeography, and ecology. He's been active in movements to reconstruct the tree of life and to link evolution to ecology and biodiversity conservation. Currently, he continues his work as a research professor at Yale. He resides in Tucson, Arizona, where he's an adjunct professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of Arizona. Dr. Donoghue, we're very happy to welcome you to the Linnaean Society of New York.
All right. Thank you so much, Debbie, for that introduction. I really appreciate it. And I'm just delighted to be here with you all and present some information, at least, about fleshy fruits and how they're dispersed by birds, with a focus on the group that I'm especially knowledgeable about, which is Viburnum, as you'll see. I'm going to begin now by sharing my screen and hope that that works properly for everybody. All right. I'm going to assume, unless somebody tells me otherwise, that everybody's able to see that picture. So I'm going to talk about fleshy fruits and their dispersal, mainly by birds. And you can see there a picture of a bird, which is happens to be a cedar waxwing eating a honeysuckle fruit, actually two fruits at once there. And then in the painting there, the picture below is Viburnum opulus. And it turns out that Viburnum is the group of plants that I study. And I can say pretty much without a doubt, it's the only thing in the world that I'm the world's expert on. And that's not really bragging so much as just to say that hardly anybody in the world is interested in these plants. And so it's not hard to be the world's expert. But I have been studying them for pretty much my entire academic career, going back almost 50 years now to when I was an undergraduate. And so over those years, we've learned quite a lot about these plants. So a lot of what I'll say, at least to begin with, is about Viburnum, and then I'll try to generalize from there and think more broadly globally about fruit colors and fruit dispersal. So Viburnum, for those of you, I think many of you probably are familiar with these plants, but it's a group of about 163 species that I recognize now, shrubs and small trees distributed around the world, as you can see on the map there, mostly in the northern hemisphere, but with a few excursions into the southern hemisphere, in the mountains, especially of the Andes there. And it's a fun group in the sense that it displays a lot of diversity in things that people are interested in. For example, some of them are evergreen plants and some of them are deciduous. Almost entirely they're pollinated by animals and almost entirely by insects. And they have fleshy fruits, as you see in the right-hand corner there, that can be multiple different colors, as I'll describe in a little bit. And this fleshy fruited bird dispersed fruit situation is what I want to describe to you today. So that's Viburnum. Now, one thing I should say about Viburnum is that many of you, I think most of you, are probably familiar with these plants. And if you're not so familiar, it's definitely the case that you have been around them quite a bit because they're planted everywhere. They're cultivated all over the world, it turns out, in gardens and around buildings on university campuses and all around most of the major cities in the world. And there are, in fact, there's the thing on the right that's the circular thing is a phylogenetic tree that shows the 163 odd species. And the ones that are highlighted in light green color there are ones that are actually brought into cultivation somewhere in the world. And it turns out that almost half the species, some 70 species, are cultivated somewhere or another. And many of them are very widespread cultivated all over the place and kind of a big deal in the horticultural industry. There's a quote at the top from a person who wrote a book about viburnum, who's a horticulturalist named Michael Durr. And he says, a garden without viburnum is akin to a life without music or art. And I like that, but it seems kind of over the top, even for me, to say that. But it is, these plants are lovely and they're widespread. And I presume most of you have seen them. Now, this is the only kind of detailed thing like this I'm going to show you. So don't get worried about this. This is a phylogenetic tree. And I just want to make the point that we know by now quite a lot about how all these 163 species are related to one another. This is based recently, at least, on molecular data, most DNA sequence data, and they help us understand how things are related. We also have a timeline there, and so you can see that viburnum goes back probably around somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 to 70 million years, and they've been evolving since then. Most of the major lineages of viburnum were established in the Eocene, let's say roughly 50 to 40 million years ago. But a lot of the recent evolution and recent speciation events have been in the last, say, 10 million years from the Miocene onward. Anyway, I won't go into any further detail about this, except to say that we know a lot, and we can now make good use of this phylogeny to understand the evolution of various things that we're interested in. And one of the things I have been interested in, this is just a little diversion, but a lot of I've spent a fair amount of time in recent years studying things like the form of the leaves of viburnum and how large and small they are. You can see here there's a sample. Each one of these represents a given viburnum species. And you can see that some of them have large leaves, some of them have small leaves, some of them have lobed leaves, some of them don't, and so forth. So there's a lot of leaf diversity, and we can use that phylogenetic knowledge to understand the sequence of evolution of these leaves over the course of the last 50, 60 million years. So this is just to emphasize that point. Viburnums are really variable in leaf shape. They're not red like this, they're green, but these have been stained so that you can see the veins properly. But you can see on the top different leaf shapes. Some of them look like maples and some of them don't, and so forth. And on the bottom, you can see that the leaf margins look different. The ones on the left-hand side here have no teeth. And as you go towards the right, they have more and bigger teeth. And so one of the things we've been interested in is the evolution of all of this diversity of leaves. And I'll just summarize some of that by showing you this diagram. And this shows that in multiple different lineages of viburnum, we see an interesting phenomenon where they start out this is showing in the background there a map of Asia, as it turns out. But they start out in more tropical climates with leaves that don't have any teeth, and then they adapt and speciate and adapt, moving northward. And as they do that, they evolve leaves that are rounder and that have leaf teeth on them. And we've been able to document this now in multiple cases in viburnum, probably on the order of a dozen cases just like this, where you go from having, narrow leaves without teeth to having rounder leaves with teeth as you get into colder climates. So that's the sort of thing we're able to do now that we know a lot about these plants. If anybody's interested, you can ask me about why that might be later, but at least that's the pattern that we've uncovered there. Now, another thing that's really variable and diverse in viburnum are the fruits. Not so much in the type of fruit. They all have the same type of fruit, but they vary in a lot of other ways, including color, which you see here. But the type of fruit, it's botanically called a drupe. And they all have these drupe fruits. And what a drupe is, it's a fleshy fruit, so it's fleshy on the outside. It has a single seed on the inside. And that's pretty much the definition of a drupe. And if you are all familiar with drupes because you're familiar with things like cherries and peaches and so forth, and those are drupe fruits. They're fleshy on the outside. They have a single seed on the inside. But there's a little more to it than that, and that is that if you open up one of these fruits and you take a cross section, let's take you have a fruit and you take a razor blade and you just make a cross section of it. you can see something, something that looks like one of these. And what it is there's a fleshy outer part, and then there's you can see a kind of a white line. I'm sort of trying to show it with my cursor. I'm not sure if you can see that, but basically there's a white line, and then there's a green line, and then on the inside there's some white stuff. Well, the white line on the outside is called the endocarp, or sometimes called the stone. That's why things like cherries are called stone fruits, because they have an endocarp like this. And this is technically it's the hardened inner wall of the ovary, and it surrounds the seed very tightly. And so when you open one of these fleshy fruits, you see an endocarp, which is a hard structure, and on the inside of that would be the single seed. And the white stuff in the middle here is the nutritive tissue for the developing embryo, the so-called endosperm. So what you can see in this is, like, if you take cross sections through viburnum fruits, you'll see that they have different shapes of endocarps and seeds inside, and that actually has attracted a fair amount of attention by people who study viburnum over the years, because it differentiates species, but also differentiates the major lineages of viburnum. Or you can tell them apart basically by differences in the shape of the endocarp and the seed. So the first person who ever really studied viburnum worldwide was a guy named Oersted, 1861, and he put a lot of emphasis on the shapes of the endocarps. And you can see this is like a reproduction of a plate out of his paper from 1861, showing cross sections of fruits, sort of like the type that I showed you a minute ago. And then on the right, you can see it. If you take the flesh off of a endocarp, you can see that they're quite different, sometimes in shape and size and grooving, and some of them look like little hearts, and some of them are more elongate, and so forth. So there's a lot of variation in this endocarp and seed shape and size. And so that's the first thing I studied, because I thought I should get to the bottom of that, try to figure out what's really going on. And so we've done a bunch of, I'm not going to bore you with this, just to say we've studied this to death in a way, making all sorts of measurements of these things and displaying that in different ways. On the right-hand side, you see another phylogenetic tree, and this showing that we can elucidate something about the evolution of these endocarp shapes using the phylogeny. So this was work done with a postdoc named Wendy Clement, who's now a professor in New Jersey. So we know a lot about this, as it turns out, and the only story that comes out of it in some sense is that you start out with sort of like a Batman type shape of these things early on in the evolution of viburnum, and then you evolve the ones on the right there, a kind of flattened one without grooves, one that looks more like a horseshoe, and one that's really round. Well, those have evolved multiple times within viburnum, those different derived shapes. Well, all of that's kind of arcane. It's interesting to me because these are traits that mark the major lineages of viburnum, and we've sort of now documented that that's really the case. But the thing is that we study these endocarps initially just in the abstract. We take off the flesh and ignore the rest of the fruit. But these things are not evolving in a vacuum or something. They're actually, endocarps are part of a whole functioning fruit that's surrounded by this fleshy stuff. And that fleshy stuff has different chemical properties. It has different textures. It has different colors. And the whole thing has to kind of work together as a unit to be a functioning fruit and to get dispersed properly. So then we started in on a series of studies of viburnum fruits, starting with looking at in more detail at color and so on. And this was the work, and I'm going to mention this person many times, the work of a graduate student named Miranda Sinnott-Armstrong here at Yale. And she's now a postdoc at Duke at the moment. But she did a bunch of really lovely studies of viburnum fruits, which I'm going to mainly focus on for the next little bit. So the first thing she did is say, well, we look at these things and we say they're different colors, like they're different shades of blue or red or black and so forth. And she dug into this and actually started measuring wavelengths what wavelengths are reflected by these things to get a more quantitative measure of the color, basically, aside from just our assessment of it. So that's what you see here, sort of reflectance spectra over this visible bunch of wavelengths. And the ones that are blue are reflecting in the blue, and the ones that are red are reflecting in the red, and the ones that are black are not reflecting much, especially across the spectrum. So that was a beginning. And then the idea was, well, okay, how does color relate to the shape of the endocarp? But also, how does it relate to anything about the chemistry of the plant and the chemistry of the fruit and so forth? The nutritive value of it, let's say. So the next thing she did was a whole series of measurements of a bunch of things that are shown in these graphs here. So, for example, if you take the one on the upper left, it's showing the lipid content. So that's the fat content, basically. And that's really an important element from the standpoint of bird nutrition. And what she found is that the fruits that are blue fruits are really lipid rich, and the fruits that are red fruited, and I've drawn an arrow between those two, have very little lipids, and they're mostly just carbohydrates, sugars. And then in the next panel, it shows moisture content, and what that shows is that the blue fruits have very little moisture, whereas the red fruits are really juicy. And in fact, I've made, like syrup out of it, like for pancakes and stuff. It's so juicy, whereas you could never do that with one of the blue fruits. The next one is about endocarp shape. And she showed that the blue fruits have round endocarps and the red fruits have flat ones, and so forth. And we don't need to go over all the details here. But basically, it turns out that she described two very clear syndromes, basically, which we call the blue syndrome and the red syndrome. So the blue ones are high in lipids, low in sugars. They have a little bit of pulp around a round endocarp, and that they're not very juicy. The red ones are low in lipids, high in carbohydrates. They have lots of moist, juicy pulp, and they surround a flat endocarp or seed. So that's basically saying, okay, there are some really interesting correlations, and they fall into different categories, these correlated traits. So that's interesting. Now, and this is just a summary of that in a way to sort of say, you start out with sort of moderate amounts of pulp and sugar and so forth. That's shown on the left. That's kind of the ancestral condition. And then several times you've evolved these blue fruits that are lipid rich and so forth. And several times you've evolved the red fruits. I say several times, but it's actually twice in both cases. That's why there's two big arrows there, two going to blue and two going to red. So that we've been able to sort out by these studies and putting it on the phylogeny and everything. So now that's interesting. So now you start to think, well, what does that mean? Maybe these have co-evolved with particular birds or something who are the dispersal agents. And they're sort of, these are attracting different sets of birds or something of that type. But it turns out to be more complicated than that. In general, I would say this is true with fruit colors and fruit syndromes of this type. So your first thought is, the different syndromes relate to dispersal by different bird species. But it turns out that in general with fruits and everything, there's not such a one-to-one relationship between a bird and a fruit. Sometimes we see that in flowers, for example, where there's a particular flower shape, like say red, long, tubular flowers that are pollinated by specific hummingbirds, let's say. So that's a kind of a more one-to-one relationship. But it turns out with fruits, it's not usually the case. And instead, there's a kind of many-to-many relationship where different bird species will eat the same fruit. So a given fruit will be visited by multiple birds, and the same fruits are eaten by different birds. So it's a kind of more of a case of not so much one-to-one relationship between a fruit of a given plant species and a bird species. That's a pretty rare thing, although I'm going to tell you a little more about that. In general, it's kind of a diffuse coevolutionary thing going on with fruit syndromes and multiple different species of birds that eat them. So it's not very clear cut at the outset. Now I've talked about the syndromes and talked a little bit about the saying that there's different colors, but how are those colors produced? And in general, in plants, when it comes to fruit colors or flower colors, for that matter, oftentimes, almost entirely, we think of them being pigments. So there's pigments that are molecules that absorb some particular wavelengths and reflect back other ones. Okay. And so that's what we call a chemical color, because it's like a particular chemical that is this pigment that's absorbing and reflecting wavelengths. Okay. That's typically what's going on with fruits and flowers. But there's another possibility, and that's called structural color. And that's where there's these little nanostructures of some type, and I'm about to show you some of these, so you'll get a clear idea of this. There's little structures on the surface of the cells on the surface of the fruit, let's say, and those interact with light to create a kind of an interference effect, which you often see as sort of a iridescent color, kind of an iridescent or metallic looking blue color, for example. So those structural colors are not caused by pigments, they're caused by physical structures, which I'm going to show you some of, on the cells on the outside of the fruit. And so you can have, in theory, you can have either pigments or structural color. Now, it turns out that structural colors are pretty common in animals, and we're all pretty familiar with them. So brightly colored butterflies and the beautiful hummingbirds that are reflecting these wonderful iridescent pinks and all this kind of stuff, and many different beetles. These are examples of structural colors. They're not pigments in the cells or anything. They're actual little nanostructures on the wings of these animals, let's say, that are creating these iridescent colors. So those, we know of a lot of good cases of structural colors in animals. But in plants, this is very rarely studied, and we know almost nothing about it. In fact, the whole history of the study of structural colors in plants is illustrated here. The first one was described in 1991, and then another one in 2000, and so forth. And these were sort of iridescent looking blue fruits that attracted attention, and people got to looking at them, and they figured out that it wasn't a pigment that was causing these colors, it was a structural color. The most recent of these, and the best studied by far, is this thing, a species of viburnum called Viburnum tinus. And you can see a picture of its fruits there. And Miranda is, again, the person who is responsible for these studies that I'm about to show you. So the idea is that she figured out that these are producing their color, their characteristic iridescent blue color, by this kind of structural mechanism that I'm about to describe. And so what it is you have to look carefully at the outside of the fruit, at the cells that are on the outside of the fruit, what we call the outer epidermis, okay? And you look at those cells, and a typical cell in a plant has these components, which you see here. One is that it has a waxy layer on the outside called a cuticle, and that keeps water in and reduces damage to the cell and everything else like that. And then there's a cell wall, which is mostly composed of cellulose. And then on the inside of the cell is the cytoplasm proper, which is where the nucleus would be and all that sort of stuff. And but that's where these pigment chemicals would normally be. So that's a typical plant cell in a typical fruit or flower, let's say. But what she found is that Viburnum tinus, when she looked at it very carefully, has a different structure because it's inserted what's called a multi-layer structure into the cell wall. So if you look at this one here, it's got a cuticle on the outside, and it has a cell wall kind of on the inside around the cytoplasm in the middle, which is the dark stuff. But it also has some new structure in there, which, if you look at that structure really carefully, it looks like it's a bunch of little globules. And what are these little globules? Well, here's what they look like under a transmission electron microscope. There's layer upon layer upon layer of these little globular structures. Here's an even closer view of it. So you can see that there's layers of these little globs, and in between that are layers of cellulose. And so that's a new kind of structure in these cells. And it turns out that that's a novel structure that hasn't been reported from any other plant or any other animal. It's kind of a new form of structural color. And it turns out that if you analyze these things carefully chemically, which isn't that easy to do, you can figure out that these are actual lipid droplets, little globs of lipid, all stuck into layers, layer upon layer. And you can do a kind of a tomographic reconstruction of this using electron microscope images. And I hope you can see that this is showing this thing kind of rotating around. And you can see that's kind of, showing you that there's these layer upon layer upon layer of these lipid globules. And so that's what's going on there. They have this new structure and it looks like this, and it's made of lipids. The way this works is it's called a multi-layer reflector. And so when light comes in, it's reflecting back out, certain wavelengths. And if you put layer upon layer like this, you can increase the brightness and make the color more intense, basically. And the more ordered the layers are, the more order they are, the more structure, the more they have to be just so much apart from one another. The more intense the color is, the brighter the color is. So what these guys have done is they've invented this structure that's this multi-layered reflector, and that's what's creating this appearance of a kind of iridescent blue fruit. So that's kind of fun. So the next thing we figured was, well, okay, here it is. It's in Viburnum tinus. Are there other viburnums that do this? And so we thought, well, let's look at a close relative of Viburnum tinus. And we chose this one, Viburnum davidii, which has these really cool colored, weird greenish colored fruits when they're young, but then they mature into these really beautiful blue fruits on these little red stalks, kind of a nice contrasting color combination that birds really like. And anyway, to make a long story short, Miranda went and looked carefully at davidii, and it has the same structure. I mean, it's very, very similar. You can see the layer upon layer of the lipid globules and everything. So that's fun. And then all of the close relatives of Viburnum tinus, and there are 7 species of them, are have this same kind of structure, and they all have this iridescent blue kind of fruit. But then Miranda said, well, let's look at a whole bunch of viburnums, not just sort of select 1 or 2 to look at. Let's look across the spectrum of viburnums and see if this pops up anywhere else in viburnum. So she went and looked at fruits of many different colors and stuff, and she found that they were all lacking this structure. So all of these fruits that you see here, the pigment, these are pigment, these are chemical colors produced by these pigments, not by these structural multi-layer reflector things. So she did a pretty thorough survey using the transmission electron microscope, and she documented this. But it turned out that she did discover 1 species, and it happens to be this one, Viburnum dentatum, from the eastern United States that many of you may be familiar with. It's called the arrowwood. Anyway, she found that it has something pretty similar to what she found in Viburnum tinus, but it's not closely related to Viburnum tinus. It's pretty distantly related. So this amounts to a case of parallel evolution of a very similar structural color situation. Now, I say very similar, but you can probably see there it's not identical. It has this structural layer with these globules, but they're not as well organized as they were in tinus and davidii. So this is what a normal cell would look like. Here's what I showed you for Viburnum tinus. And here's kind of an illustration of what Viburnum dentatum looks like, with globules that are not as well organized into layers. And so in general, these produce a blue color, but not nearly as iridescent looking as Viburnum tinus and its relatives. And you can see this is what it looks like through a transmission electron microscope. Lipid globules not so organized into layers, but they're still functioning to create a bit of an iridescent blue color, but not nearly as intense. So that's where we stand now. It turns out that since then, and that was just a couple of years ago, Miranda's gone on and discovered that this is actually a phenomenon that's popped up in multiple places in plants. So in Viburnum, we have described it pretty well, but she's now described this in ribes, and which are the currants or the gooseberries, and in lantana that some of you will be familiar with. And so here's just an example from lantana. This is work again from Miranda, just published recently, and showing an iridescent blue fruit, showing that it has these layers, layer upon layer of lipid globules. So it's a very similar thing, and it's evolved very independently in a very distantly related group of plants. And again, you can do these tomographic reconstructions, and you can see that it's got this layered structure to it. So, so that's fun. Now, another aspect of this is, how does this relate to birds? And in other words, we now know something about how these colors are produced, and it's kind of a special color and everything with the iridescence. How does that relate to bird dispersal? So one possibility is that this is a case of what's called honest signaling, that the blue fruits, these iridescent blue fruits, signify high lipid content to a bird. So a bird goes, oh, I know that if I go to that fruit and eat it, I'm going to get a bunch of good nutrition, and it'll tide me over as I migrate, let's say. So that's a possibility. They've come to associate this particular blue color with a high nutrition content, high lipid content. So the way that works, and it's kind of interesting, is that the signal and the reward are both the same in this case. They're produced by these lipids. So the signal, this multi-layered structure that I talked to you about, is made by these lipids, but the lipids also serving as the reward for the bird. So this is this one can imagine is an honest signal to the bird of if you come and eat me, you're going to get some good lipid content out of me. And so that's sort of fun. Now, then you might start thinking, well, maybe there are birds that are kind of specialized. I mentioned earlier that birds are not that specialized on different fruit colors, but maybe this is a case where there is some degree of specialization. And in fact, it appears that that is the case. So this is a case of greater specificity between a plant and a bird. Viburnum tinus is often visited and dispersed successfully by the European robin, which you see here. And so they'll come through and eat a lot of these fruits, and they are an important part of the diet of these things. They also eat insects and stuff, but then as they're in the fall, in the autumn, they will turn to eating fruits, and they eat a lot of these viburnum fruits, as it turns out. And this is more of an arcane point, but one that I find to be really interesting. So there was a study by a guy named Carlos Herrera from Spain in 1984, and he was studying the birds and bird dispersal in the Mediterranean region of southern Spain, mainly. And he found that there were two cases of a real tight relationship between a bird and a particular plant fruit. And one of them that I've highlighted in red is Viburnum tinus with the European robin. The other one right above there in the quote is a pistachio species and the European blackcap. So he said these are two really tight relationships where the bird is eating a lot of those fruits, and the fruit is mainly being dispersed by that bird. And then he said, look, there's a lot of other fruits in these communities that are visited and eaten by these birds. But if it weren't for these key species that have these very tight relationships, you wouldn't be able to maintain such a diverse group of birds in here, that if you just had a few species that weren't so special and rich in lipids and stuff like this, that you would have a really depauperate bird situation. The plants wouldn't be able to support a big bird community of dispersers. But the fact that these tight relationships exist in a couple of cases between a bird and a plant allows a lot of other plants with less nutritious fruits to coexist in these communities, and allows a bigger bird population to exist as well. So this is a pretty interesting relationship between a special fruit with a special color and a special lipid content and a particular species of bird in this system. And it has a lot of consequences for the structure of these ecological communities and the maintenance of the biodiversity. So now it turns out, if you're wondering, Viburnum dentatum in the eastern United States is also dispersed it's dispersed by a number of other birds, but it's very commonly visited and dispersed by the American robin. Incidentally, this is a time for me to say I don't know much at all about birds. I'm a botanist. That's a point I'll return to at the very end. But I do know that the European robin and the American robin are not particularly closely related to one another. So they look similar because they're red-breasted and so forth, but they're not particularly closely related. And but in any case, these two birds are involved in a fairly particular way with these particular species that have these kind of bright blue, iridescent blue fruits in Viburnum. Now, as it turns out, there's another thing I want to mention about Tinus and dentatum is that they are examples of what are called massed fruiters. That is to say, they'll produce a huge amount of fruit at a particular time during the season. And so all of a sudden, there's this huge nutritious crop of fruits that pops up, and all sorts of birds come through and eat them, and usually on their way migrating in the fall somewhere. But it turns out that that's an unusual feature too, that most viburnums actually have what's called sequential fruiting, where they take a long time to mature their fruits. They don't all mature at once. And instead, they'll start out as being red colored, and then one by one, they'll sort of turn black colored. And that's what you see in this particular species, Viburnum plicatum. So this is showing fruits that are developing from a red to a black color, and then eventually sort of getting more liquidy and sort of breaking down a little bit inside. And that's when birds really love to pick them off. And so these fruit over a long period of time and gradually turn from red to black and become attractive to birds that way. I've watched this. I lived in a house in Connecticut where I had one of these plants outside my window so I could observe birds coming at the right time and everything. So this is the gray catbird selectively eating the black fruits out of these off of these plants. So they leave the red ones and take the black ones. I was even able to follow these birds around my yard a little bit and find them sort of pooping out these endocarps with the seeds inside. And that's what you see down below. It's like I actually sort of trace these things. And then I actually took the time to figure out how do they germinate and everything. And they germinate just fine after they've gone through the gut of a bird. So that's what's going on with most viburnums. So it turns out that the Viburnum tinus and the Viburnum dentatum, with their special color and the lipid content, they're also doing this unusual thing in terms of all at the same time turning color and not doing it sequentially, and producing a whole lot of nutritious fruits at once. There's a third strategy in Viburnum, which is quite interesting, I think. And that is there are some fruits, some of these red fruits that have almost no lipids. They're just kind of juicy and full of sugars and everything. They don't taste very good. I think some of you might have tasted this. In the eastern United States, we have a species just like this. So you might have seen this. They hang on the plant oftentimes through the entire winter. So you can see them with snow on them, like you see in that picture on the left. And on the right, you can see that there's cedar waxwings that are on this viburnum and that are picking off those fruits. And this is happening mostly in March and April. So these things will hang on the plant all through the winter. And then suddenly, when birds are sort of running out of anything, frugivorous birds are running out of other fruits to eat, they'll turn to these as kind of a last resort. In desperation, they'll take these things. And so that's another kind of strategy that viburnums have evolved in relation to bird dispersal. Down below, there's a graph that shows that in April, for example, Viburnum opulus is a huge percentage of the fruits that are available to these cedar waxwings. All right. Now, I just want to, in the time remaining, I want to broaden out and say, we've been talking about a particular group of plants. Let's just think more broadly about fruit colors around the globe. And this is a bunch of pictures of fruits, and you can see that they come in different colors, whites and reds and oranges and greens and so forth. really nice purple colors and so forth. And you think to yourself, wow, that's a huge diversity. And the other thing is that if you think about this from a standpoint of plant evolution, these things have evolved multiple times. Each of these fruit types has evolved many different times. You're very familiar with that, partly because of the fruits that you eat. Like there's red raspberries and blackberries. Those are very closely related, but they've evolved these different colors. Or blueberries and cranberries. So it's very easy to, move, to change fruit colors, and these things have evolved multiple different times. But interestingly, you look at that and go, wow, there's every possible fruit color, but it's not actually true. So this was from a paper we did earlier, a little before Miranda got involved in all of this. We were interested in this question. And what you see here is a little tetrahedral structure that represents the color space that birds can see. So birds can see in the UV. They have 4 basic cone types, which are represented at the vertices of this little tetrahedron. And then the little black dots inside of it are fruit colors from around the world, from different locations, where we were able to measure the wavelengths of these different fruits and put them into this color space that the birds can see. So that's kind of a cool way to represent it. But what's striking about it is that many different fruit colors have evolved, but they have not evolved all of the fruit colors that birds could see, right? In other words, and that's an interesting question. And by the way, an open question. Why haven't plants moved out of this sort of fairly small part of the space into even weirder colors that birds could see and maybe be attracted to preferentially? So it turns out that if you measure this, only about 17% of the space, the visual space that birds can see, is actually occupied by fruits. Now, this is not every fruit in the world. This is a sample of multiple fruits, obviously, and they are taken from around the world. But it's still, an interesting observation that not every possible fruit color has evolved. In fact, that there could be more that birds could be attracted to. Now, one of the things I've been interested in for years is the geographic distribution of different fruit colors. And I got onto this especially in the early 1990s. I was traveling around in China with this guy, Dave Buford. He's a great plant collector. And we're walking through the woods in northern China. And we started saying, God, look, there's another red fruited thing, and there's another red fruited thing, and there's another one. And we said to ourselves, do you think there's more red fruits here than there would be in Eastern North America, let's say, in Connecticut or New York? And we thought, yeah, it seems like there's way more red fruits. So that stuck in my brain as we were walking around. And later I had a postdoc named Eugenia Lowe and then later Miranda. And we started thinking more about this. What's the geographic distribution of different fruit colors? Is there any pattern? Like, is there more red fruits in the old world than the new world? Or what? And it turns out then that Miranda went on and developed a database of like thousands of fruits from different fruit colors from different localities around the world. So the localities are shown with the black dots. In the bottom part, you can see that those black dots cover many different, what we call biomes, with vegetation types with different precipitation and temperature and so forth. So we've got a fairly good coverage of the globe and of the different biomes and looking at fruit color. And what do we find? Are there any patterns? Earlier I was contrasting China to Eastern North America, but it turns out that's not what's happening. What is happening, first of all, is that in the tropics, so on the x-axis here, you see the 0 latitude, that's the equator. Around the equator, and this is on the y-axis, a measure of fruit color diversity. You can see that fruit color diversity is maximized around the equator. And it falls off, especially in the northern hemisphere, you fall off very rapidly towards a very small subset of fruit colors, a little bit less rapidly in the southern hemisphere. So that's the first observation, is that there's more fruit color variation at the tropics than there is towards the poles. Nice, that's a nice latitudinal gradient. But the cool thing that she discovered at this time was that, you remember I was talking about how there may be more red fruits in China. It turns out that's not the case, but it is the case that there's more red fruits at higher latitudes. So that's shown in this middle panel here. Like if you're down near the equator, it's a smaller number of red fruited species in a given forest. And if you move away towards the poles, you find that there's a higher percentage of fruits that are red. Okay, I hope that makes sense to people. At the same time, you can observe patterns in these other colors, but down here, this thing called goby, these are green and orange and yellow fruits. These kinds of fruits fall off as you go from the equator and get many fewer species with green and yellow and orange fruits as you get towards the higher latitudes. So in the tropics, we have a lot of these. In the temperate zone, we have very few. So these are really interesting global patterns in fruit colors. And as a kind of a concrete demonstration of that, you do these studies and you think, is it really true? Have I convinced myself even that there's more red fruits at higher latitudes? And the answer is, if you go to a high latitude place, like last summer, I happened to be up in Denali Park, in Alaska. And these are pictures that I took while I was there. And I saw one blue fruit up there, but everything else was red fruited. I won't go into all the species here. This is a dogwood. This one in the lower left, by the way, is a Viburnum edgely. This one next to it is elderberry, and so forth. So every species of plant that I saw up there was fruiting, and it was fruiting red fruits. And I thought, oh my God, yeah, we nailed that. We were definitely right. There's a lot more red fruits. And now that I've mentioned it to you, as you go around the world, you should keep this in mind, and you'll see that this is pretty much true, that a lot more red fruits at high latitudes and a lot fewer yellow ones. And you go to the tropics, yellow ones are all over the place. Another thing is that Miranda also measured fruit sizes and related that to color. And it turns out that, as you can see in this graph on the lower left here, as you get into the large fruits that are, say, 60 millimeters, that's a pretty big fruit. Almost all of those large fruits are yellow or orange or green. And whereas the smaller fruits tend to be the ones that are red and blues and blacks. So there's also a relationship with fruit size here. Now, that makes you wonder, so there's almost these syndromes, right? Where in the tropics, you get a lot more yellow and green fruits, and they're also larger on average, those colors. So this is kind of explained, and now I'm winding down here. This is sort of explained, has been explained in the past by something called the disperser syndrome hypothesis, which says that the bird syndrome in terms of fruit colors is to have highly contrastive fruits that are blue or red or black, and oftentimes contrasting with some background color, like the color of leaves or some other part of the plant. Whereas the mammal syndrome is described as less contrastive, more dull colors, like these greens and oranges and browns and that kind of color. So in the mammal syndrome, you get these less bright colors and just generally less showy, and also often larger and often having a strong odor. And of course, that's related to the fact that a lot of mammals are foraging for fruits, and they're doing it at night, like things like bats. And so, they're not so visually tuned in, and they're more turned into things like odors like that to find fruits. So that's been the general idea. So again, Miranda decided to test that in a more general way. And that's what I'll show you in the next slide, which is a bit complicated, but it's interesting. It basically substantiates this idea. When you look across the globe, in the panel here at the top, you look at the globe, the dark colors are the dark blues here. That signifies a prevalence of these contrastive bird colors, whereas the yellow here around the equator is a higher percentage of those duller yellow fruits and so forth, right? So that there is a geographic pattern that kind of corresponds also to bird and mammal distributions, right? And so, a lot more of these kind of dull, large, dull, smelly fruits, around the tropics. And as you get up to northern places, there's a prevalence of these bird colors like the red that I showed you a minute ago in Alaska. And then this is down at the bottom here, shows the relative prevalence of bird frugivores. This was measured in a quite complicated way that I don't want to go into, but it's a pretty decent measure. But basically that corresponds too. So the place where we have, look across Russia here, for example, down here, there's a lot of birds. The birds are the more prevalent dispersers, and that's also the place where we have the most contrastive fruit colors, right? Whereas in the tropics, you're having a lower percentage of bird frugivores and a higher percentage of mammal frugivores. And there in the tropics is where we find these mammal colored fruits, the more greens and yellows and so forth. I hope that makes sense. Now, there's some anomalies in here too, which is interesting. So you go up here into Alaska, let's say, on this lower diagram, look up towards where Alaska is. There's a lot of yellow colors in there, which means that there's a fairly high prevalence of mammals dispersing fruits. So who are those mammals? Well, in the tropics, they would be monkeys and things like that, right? But up here, there are things like bears, honestly. When I was in Alaska, I was looking at bear scat and finding lots of remnants of fruits in there, lots of endocarps and stuff like that, including my viburnum fruits. Oddly enough, there's a fair number of mammals up here in the western United States and up into Alaska that are actually dispersing fruits with contrastive colors. So there are some interesting anomalies in the distribution. I don't think I'll belabor that anymore, but that was an interesting attempt to test this whole general theory about disperser syndrome hypothesis. With that, I think I'm going to wind down and just, I have one parting thought for you. And the parting thought is that, there's so many interesting and still unresolved problems about why fruits have the colors and the chemistry and whatnot that they have. I've just touched the surface of this, and I hope I've shown you that there's some interesting stuff going on. But what I feel at the end of the day is that we need much better communication and collaboration between botanists and ornithologists in this area. Botanists go and study their fruits and whatever, and ornithologists go and study their birds, but rarely do they sit down together to really take a hard look at some of these questions that we're talking about here. And I really recommend that in the future, that we really need a lot more of that kind of collaborative work going on in these systems. And so I hope at least I've convinced you of that. And with that, I'll just thank you. I really appreciate the invitation. Thanks to Debbie and to Ruth and to Doug Fatuma, who invited me in the first place. And I'll stop here, and if there are questions, we can have a discussion about those. Thank you so much.
So it's my task to invite questions. So please enter questions in the Q&A box here, and there is a question for you, Michael. Does the nutrient composition of Viburnum opulatum change over the winter so that they become more attractive to waxwings?
Yeah, so it turns out that has actually been studied once, and it turns out that the chemistry does not change significantly. I initially thought, well, if you let them go through the winter, they'll be somehow tastier to a bird, because they've been frozen and thawed and frozen and thawed and stuff. And I thought maybe that's going to change the chemical composition, but somebody actually did study that, and they don't change at all, and they're still pretty gross. I mean, I don't know if you've tasted these things. They taste very bitter, and anyway, they don't change substantially over the winter. So the theory is that birds just get cedar waxwings just get a little more desperate, and they'll start eating really nasty fruits in April, while there's no fruits on the other plants.
Sure, there's nothing left.
Yeah, so it's all about they turn to that as kind of a last resort, I guess, even though there's nothing tastier about it after the winter. Mhm.
So here's a uh, Carrie says, thank you for voicing the need for communication between botanists and ornithologists. And Carrie poses two related questions, which are, I think they'd be thought-provoking. First, if there's a many-to-many relationship between viburnum fruits and bird distributors overall, is there research related to germination success with regard to these species dispersal relationships?
Yes, there's not enough. So the general idea has always been that plants like these that are eaten by birds, that when the fruit goes through the gut of the bird and comes out the other end, that will increase the germination success. And it's even been said that some plants really require going through a bird, before they can properly germinate. And that has been tested in a number of different cases. And in Viburnum, we find that is generally true. So but not entirely. I mean, you can be a Viburnum and not go through a bird gut and still germinate, but your chances of germinating go up after you've gone through. And it really has to do more with abrasion and sort of breaking down a little bit that endocarp to let water in, so that to start the germination process. So going through a bird gut actually kind of helps to abrade this endocarp a little bit and to let water in. That's what people have found. But we can get viburnums to germinate without putting it through a bird. I can just go collect a viburnum, bring it indoors, and plant it and get it to germinate. But they don't germinate very well that way. I can get a few to germinate. But the way we do it the way botanists do this in general is, if you have a fruit like this, you abrade it, you scarify it. You take a nail file and you just rub against the endocarp, and then you plant it. And so that's giving sort of the effect of going through a bird gut. You just abrade it a little bit and it starts to let in some water. So, but it does really help to go through a bird gut. I hope that kind of answers that.
So let me just, before getting to the second part of Carrie's question, suggest that running a bird dispersed fruit, the question is, what happens if you run it through a mammal gut instead? Or I'm thinking of a paper that in Evolution decades ago that talked about the tomato species endemic to the Galapagos Islands and being dispersed by going through the guts of tortoises.
Yeah.
So does it really matter what kind of gut the fruit is going through?
My own, I mean, I don't know this for a fact, but my gut feeling, so to speak, is that any old gut will do. In other words, I think and mammals do eat viburnum fruits, and especially, during the winter, some of these ones that hang on, mammals will come around and eat them. But there hasn't been a very careful study of the difference between that'd be an interesting thing to do. Feed the same fruits to mammals and birds and see whether you get the same germination success. While I'm on that topic, though, I have to say, seed germination is something that people don't appreciate the complexity of in general, I think. And viburnum is a very complicated situation in particular. And the reason for that is many of them have what's called double dormancy. And what that means is that the bird eats the fruit, right? And it poops it out somewhere. Then it has to go through a cold period during the winter, right? And then it puts down a little root, and it sits there through the next summer. In that condition. And then they need another cold period before they put up a shoot. So viburnum fruits take forever to germinate. And, so
that sounds like natural selection has something that has been falling flat on its face.
Yeah.
That doesn't make sense.
It's really silly, right? But
so let me go on to the second point that Carrie raises, who says, second, since there are many native and non-native species of viburnum in the Northeast, do native birds show any preference for native viburnum fruits? or do they eat from the entire genus indiscriminately? It seems that ornamental viburnums have naturalized more slowly or not at all compared to Photinia, for example.
No, great questions. Really fun. Okay, first of all, it is the case that a number of viburnums are coming out of cultivation in the eastern United States and moving into our woods. None of them are highly invasive yet. I mean, you can find them in the woods, but they're not really taking over. The way, for example, some of the honeysuckles have done, they really they've made a mess out of some forests, especially in the Midwest, But viburnums are not such a threat in terms of invasion. And part of it is because of this germination behavior that I described a minute ago. But in terms of birds, the picture I took of the gray catbird in my backyard was on an ornamental viburnum, Viburnum plicatum, which is native to Japan and China, right? And so the native birds will actually come around and pick the fruits of ornamental viburnums, that's for sure. And so they can distribute them from there into the woods. They don't often, like I say, they don't often become nasty invaders, but they can definitely do that. Do they show a preference for the native viburnums? And I think the answer is we don't know. I've only seen one. There was a study that tried to make a statement about that, but it was very limited. So, the one study that I know of said they do have a preference for the native ones, but I am not sure I believe that. And it was a very limited study. So I think the truthful answer is we don't know the answer to that, basically. But we do know that the native birds will visit the viburnums, the non-native viburnums. Will they visit them more or less? That's, I don't
know. So Richard Zeman asked the question that I would probably have asked if the opportunity presented itself. Why do leaf margins need teeth? And I know you have something to say about that.
So this is a very controversial thing, and it turns out that there's like literally a dozen different hypotheses about. It's a fairly well-established pattern that at the equator, you very rarely have plants with teeth. When you look at the trees. When you go, to Alaska, everything has teeth or lobes or something like that. And so it's a well-established pattern across many plants and every continent and everything like that. So people have been grappling with, why is it the case? What's so good about teeth when you're in a cold climate, or what's so good about no teeth in a warm climate, And there have, the hypotheses range all over the map about why this would be good. And they relate to other factors. It's really rather complicated. They relate to other factors like leaf thickness. So leaves are also thinner as you get away from the equator too. And there's one set of hypotheses that sort of say when you have thin leaves, there's some advantage to having teeth. I'm not going to go into the details of that because it's an argument that doesn't fit well with me. We ourselves have developed our own little hypothesis about this. And I'm not sure it's right, but it's at least it deserves some more testing. And that is that plants that live in northern climates, let's say, where it's cold, they spend most of their life inside of a little resting bud. The leaves are developed inside of a little resting bud, which is what you see during the winter. So all these plants are deciduous, right? So they would drop all their leaves in the fall, and then they have these resting buds. And then in the spring, within about a week, everybody's familiar with this, within about a week, all these buds open up, right? And all this stuff has to come out like a riot, like all these leaves have to come out all of a sudden. So we developed the idea that this pattern, global pattern, has to do with leaves resting inside of buds and being able to pack as much leaf tissue inside of a resting bud as possible. And it turns out that mathematically, you can show that lobed leaves you can pack more leaf tissue if you lobe your leaves. I mean, this is hard to believe, but this much has been shown. You can pack more leaf tissue inside of a resting bud if you have lobed leaves. We think that's sort of true for leaves with teeth as well, but that's a bit of a speculation. But the idea is that maybe it doesn't have to do with the function of the adult leaves. Maybe it has to do with their resting inside of resting buds during the winter and then having to come out really fast and start to photosynthesize really quickly. But the short answer, if anybody really wants to know, is that we don't know the answer to this. It's an incredibly well-known pattern without actually a very clear explanation. I personally favor my little explanation, but if other people, if Tom Givnish was in the room, he would pound the table and say that's got to be wrong and his theory is right and so forth. So we're still at that stage.
So moving on to a question from Bob Paxton: is there a reason why red fruits are commoner in higher latitudes? And which relates to, are they just proportionately because there aren't as many yellow mammal dispersed fruits, or is it really there are more reds compared to blues and so forth?
The proportion.
And why would that be?
The proportion of species with red fruits is higher at northern latitudes. That's the pattern. But then it's just like the leaf tooth thing, but okay, that's the pattern, but why? And there again, there are multiple theories. Some of them relate to things like UV radiation, believe it or not. So in other words, they're not relating to dispersal agents. They're really related to environmental variables. The environmental variable that's very strong, of course, is growing season. And now, okay, you could say I'm obsessed with growing season because I just gave that explanation for leaf teeth, right? But the idea is that many fruits, I think most people have noticed this, they go through a series of colors as they get to their mature color. So they're green, and then they become yellow, and then they become red, and then they become blue or black, right? So there's often that progression. But if you're living at a high latitude where the growing season is really short, you might have shortened that sequence, basically, and so you mature your fruits as red fruits instead of going all the way to being a black fruit. So this is it's a term that you'll be familiar with, Doug, called neoteny. Or more generally, what we call pedomorphosis, where you mature your fruit with an immature fruit color, so to speak. And so that's a possible explanation. But I mean, this is what astounds me, right? There are these very clear patterns that we described, like with leaf teeth and with fruit color. And I would say in neither case am I convinced there's a good explanation for it. And that is shocking. Here we are in the year 2023, after all these hundreds of years of natural history, and we still haven't come up with a very good explanation. In fact, we just discovered that pattern. We're just discovering these patterns, much less getting a really good evolutionary explanation.
So before I go on to the next question, can I just have a personal reaction, which is that in zoology, basically, zoologists have been preoccupied forever with finding adaptive explanations or dreaming up adaptive stories for every feature of every animal that you can imagine. Whereas, I've gone through life knowing all sorts of things, features that can be used to identify plants, and for almost none of them could I be, am I aware of any studies or speculations as to what the adaptive value might be, other than some obvious things about flower color, but obvious things about some fruit dispersal features, but it goes on and on, venation patterns and everything else.
Right.
Various kinds of pubescence and hirsuteness and puberulent leaves and all the rest of it. There how many different terms there are for hairs on leaves. Anyway, it seems as if botanists have been either more careful or just not as interested in what the possible functions may be of the features that we use to identify plants.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to say I agree with you. I teach courses about plant identification, and plant, all the different plant diversity and everything else like that. And every year I get the same question. It's like, okay, we know that this plant family has opposite leaves, and this other family has alternate leaves. Why?
Right. Yeah.
I'm like, I don't know. It's like it's really frustrating and depressing that we don't have really good explanations for these things. But I don't think it's a lack of imagination, in the sense that botanists do invent arguments, but they're pretty hard to test a lot of times.
Yeah.
And
sure.
And there's only been one or two attempts to test them, so you're never quite sure, But it's not for lack of inventing hypotheses. I mean, people will still make up all sorts of ideas about the adaptive significance, but they're not tested very much. So we're a little less comfortable with that.
Okay, we have a few more questions. There's one here from someone who's done some interesting work. Christina asks, "Do you know anyone who studies the germination of seeds consumed and pooped by bears? I started a study on sun bears in Borneo, but our co-PI went missing in action post-COVID, so apparently it didn't get anywhere. So has anyone studied how seeds do with bears?"
Well, I mean, not to my knowledge. In other words, I was going around looking at this and sort of saying, "Oh, that'd be a fun thing to see how they germinate," but I don't know of a single study that's looked at that. And so that's another just wide open. This goes back to the first question about going through a mammal gut versus a bird gut.
That's right. Sure.
Yeah. But I think the answer is we don't know, to be honest.
And so Larry Master also has some personal experience that prompts a question. In Costa Rica 2 years ago, I noticed that green leaves become bright red under UV light at night. Is this commonplace and I just hadn't noticed it before? Is there adaptive significance to this?
Yeah. It's an interesting question. The thing that people observe the most in tropical countries when it comes to leaves is that when leaves are young and growing really rapidly, when they're flushing, they're often red, various shades of bright red and everything else like that. And it's not a phenomenon we see so much up here in the north. We see it a little bit, but so I mean that's a common pattern, and it's another common pattern that we don't have a very good explanation for, I'm afraid. I mean, I hope people listening are going, well, they could think, this guy's an idiot. He doesn't have any answers to any of these questions. But I hope the real message is we need people to study these things and not just speculate about it, but actually go out there and study it. And the phenomenon that he's mentioning is one that has not been studied really. Right. There were a couple of studies, that mentioned it, but not a good experimental study.
Right. Yeah. He says that he goes on to say that he never noticed this UV reflectance with mammals, despite working in the mammal collection in the 70s in a place that I know well, the University of Michigan Museum of Zoology.
Oh my God, that's fantastic.
I know about that. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, it's funny, even a simple experiment like just going around with a UV light and see what lights up.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
I mean, people do this. People do this in their spare time, but it hasn't been studied very well.
Right. So a kind of wacky question occurred to me when we looked at the plot that you did with Rick Prum and a bunch of other people of where fruits are situated. I guess was viburnum fruit situated in the tetrahedron that describes the axes of bird color vision. And one of those axes is the UV axis. We don't have that one, but birds do. They can see in the ultraviolet, and so you have a lot of variation among plants in that diagram that you showed. There are some that none of them go all the way up to the very peak of the UV axis, but a lot of them get a lot further there than others.
That's right.
And you have any sense what that might be? That I have two questions. One, what does that look like to our eyes? Is there any difference at all among those fruits along that UV axis that would in any way be visible to us? but more importantly, any sense at all of, again, what that might do in terms of, let's say the particular species of dispersal agents that might be attracted to them. And I know very little about the degree to which bird species may differ in their UV sensitivity.
I know nothing about that, not being a bird guy particularly. I mean, that's the sort of thing, like you said, Rick Prum or somebody would know more about. But first of all, in those plots, those plots did include a few viburnums, but those are plants from all over the world. All different.
Okay, that's right. It wasn't just okay.
Yeah. And they do vary in that axis. So some of them are that kind of thing. It's kind of a curving little structure inside of that tetrahedron. And some of them have a more UV reflectance than others.
Yeah.
And you could imagine some. I mean, it's imaginable, that you would have a fruit that was way up there at the top and just sort of, visible in the UV, but not visible in any other way.
Yeah. That would be.
And birds can see it. Birds can see it, but we can't.
Well, we would probably see a black object of some kind.
Yeah, or something.
But it really is intriguing, and I know nothing at all about differences among bird species in their use of the UV spectrum. And if anyone does, I'd love to hear about that.
I would too. Maybe
something for me to look up. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the answer is we don't really know. There's a few species of birds that have been really well studied for their vision. There's what's the one? There's a small bird that tetrahedron is based on, and it was actually work done here by Tim Goldsmith at Yale, who initially described the vision of birds using a couple different bird species. But it's to go around and study birds in general and sort of say how much are they seeing in the UV. I don't know of any study like that. So.
Okay. Now here's a question which is very definitely in your area, from Carrie. Could you say a little about taxonomy? Namely, when and why was Viburnum moved out of the Caprifoliaceae?
Oh yeah, okay. that was
my reaction to how dare they change what I learned way back when, right?
Well, when I was getting into this business in the 70s, Viburnum was very definitely part of the Caprifoliaceae,
which includes honeysuckles and some other things that people would be familiar with, I guess.
Elderberries, honeysuckles, but also many cultivated plants that you might know the name of, like Abelia, Colquitzia, Dipelta, Heptacodium. I could go on with a list of these things that are cultivated, and you've seen them, but that includes many ornamental shrubby plants, basically. And what we discovered this was actually came out of my dissertation, more or less, was that Viburnum is related to elderberries. They're closely related, but they're actually very distantly related. They haven't shared a common ancestor with honeysuckles for about 100 million years, right? So they're very distant in time wise. But it turns out that the main thing we discovered is that honeysuckles and the other Caprifoliaceae that you're familiar with are actually more closely related to valerians and Dipsacus, the teasel. And those groups were never part of the Caprifoliaceae, So we found that honeysuckles are more closely related to those little herbaceous plants than they are to viburnums and elderberries. And so we rearranged the whole taxonomy. So this broader group that includes viburnum and honeysuckles is called the Dipsacales. And we rearranged the taxonomy of the Dipsacales so it now has two families. One family is called the Adoxaceae, which includes viburnum and elderberries. The other is called broadly the Caprifoliaceae, and it includes these herbaceous plants that were always excluded. And so it turns out I initially based that conclusion on morphological characters in the 70s and 80s, right? But then the molecular data, we got a lot of molecular data, and that confirmed it in no uncertain terms that Viburnum and Sambucus are related. Viburnum and the elderberries are related. Honeysuckles are more closely related to these derivative herbaceous plants. And so Yeah, that's why we did the rearrangement. It's complicated. There's nothing complicated about the relationships. We've got them pretty well figured out. We've sort of beat this to death with so much molecular data you wouldn't believe it. But how you want to divvy that up in terms of, we could have called the whole thing caprifoliaceae, for example, but we decided to sort of say, well, the Viburnum sambucus lineage is a really old lineage that's really separate from these other ones, so we divided it that way. But the main conclusion was you got to include these herbaceous plants in with caprifoliaceae now, and that sort of sticks in people's, and that's harder for people to accept. So it's not just that we separated Viburnum and sambucus from honeysuckles and stuff. It's that we included honeysuckles with these herbaceous plants, and that drove people kind of crazy. I think everybody's kind of gotten more used to it now, but that was the discovery.
Right. I'm just remark. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, incidentally, you know how it is with rules of nomenclature, right? And the botanical nomenclatural situation is a little bit different from the one it's governed by a different code of nomenclature than in zoology. Mm-hmm. But there's a committee that votes on things from time to time, and it turns out that there was an older family name for what we call the Adoxaceae, and it's actually called the Viburnaceae, and it was published 2 years before Adoxaceae, as someone discovered. And so the proclamation is that we really should be calling Viburnum and the elderberries and stuff, it's probably according to the code and nomenclatural priority, it probably should be called Viburnaceae. So you'll start to see that now in the literature more.
Okay.
But for years now, but for 20 years, 30 years, we've been calling it Adoxaceae. So there's also a desire to kind of keep that around just for continuity with the literature.
Well, at least outsiders who aren't botanists probably will be more familiar with Viburnum than Adoxa, which I have to say I don't know what that would be.
Yeah. Incidentally, that's an interesting thing. I mean, just let me say, Viburnum and the elderberries are woody plants, but they're close. The closest relative of elderberries is a little herbaceous plant called Adoxa.
Oh, okay.
It's about that big.
Yeah. Okay. Which I don't know. I just want to mention, by the way, that you talked about waxwings and thrushes, and that they have different preferences. And it turns out, and in fact, I'm reading now from that book that I showed you at the start, that thrushes eat lipid-rich fruits and cedar waxwings mostly sugary fruits. And it turns out that they differ in their digestive enzymes. So thrushes have enzymes for digesting fats, and basically they don't digest sugars. And apparently it's the same with the opposite with cedar waxwings. So there's there are real evolutionary consequences of these diet adopting these different diets. I thought that was really intriguing, that it's not just behavior, but that there's some physiology that reinforces the choice of food.
That is so cool. That is so cool. But this is exactly why my final comment was, we need these collaborations, because you ornithologists are going around with this kind of knowledge that is not, most botanists don't know that, right? And we're going around with knowledge that you don't know, so it's like, but if you put those together, it'd be really great. And the fact that it works out, that these lipid-rich viburnums are, have and cedar waxwings are going after the sugary ones. It all makes sense now.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. Well, Michael, I think that we've come to the end of the evening, and I want to thank you. And I'm sure that the numerous participants, I think we have had about 57 people, or at least attending, and I think I can safely say that this has been a really intriguing, a very different topic from what the Linnean usually hears, but it's refreshingly different. And I want to thank you for a really intriguing presentation. So thanks so much.
My pleasure entirely. Thanks to everybody. Bye-bye.